Hi again, folks. Alex Ford here. Welcome back to this series on communities of principle. This is the third and final part of this series. If you've missed any of them so far, you can pick them up on my website, andallthat.co.uk. In the first two episodes, we talked about, first of all, the power of community and the power of subject communities in particular. And in the second, we thought about some of the problems that communities can bring of excluding people, of excluding voices, and so on. In this final episode, I want to talk about the ways in which we can direct our time meaningfully. So I still think it's really powerful, really important to be part of communities of practice and professional communities. So how do we ensure we are taking part in communities that are principled and can further the cause of justice in education? That's what I want to go into today. I hope you enjoy the discussion. And if there's anything, as ever, you want to talk about, please do get in touch with me on Twitter at APF102. Well, first of all, I think we need to be able to make ethical choices about which communities to be part of. And principles are a good place to start because, as we've seen, some communities can have principles which are problematic, which are negative. So, first test, does a community make its principles clear? If a community pretends it doesn't have principles, I think there's a problem straight away. And then, are those principles defensible? And by defensible, I think we've got to use some kind of metric to do this with. So for me, it's including, hearing and addressing the needs of young people. I think that's a way that I would test principles. If they do those things and they have those things at their centre, then I think they're doing a good job. Or you might like to come to some other things. The UN Convention on the Rights of the Child has 3 articles in it which deal very specifically with the rights to education. If the principles of your communities meet these things, then I think they're probably not bad principles. They're inclusive. They respect human life. They respect other human beings. So I'm going to suggest this as a framework for making some ethical decisions about the professional communities we spend our time in and we dedicate our time to. The first test I would suggest is this one. Is the community open and inclusive? Can anyone join? Does it look to be more diverse? Secondly, does it have principles? And are they rooted in the needs of children? And crucially, all children, not just a select group of them, but is it rooted in the needs of all children? Do those principles help to tackle the problems that we've just seen of lack of diversity, lack of inclusion, lack of pedagogical narrowing? Does the community challenge the powerful voices who don't keep those children's needs central? Does it seek truth and justice through its actions? So does it look to have inclusive, rigorous, diverse education that does justice to the past and present? In a history community, I think that's vital. Does it have a shared body of knowledge? And is participation in knowledge creation valued as much, if not more than, just using the resources? Because if it's not doing those things, it's not really a professional community in any sense. You're not part of it, you're just consuming it. Does it enable members to have a positive impact on students? I think that's fairly straightforward. And finally, is it honest and open to criticism? So if there are things wrong, does it recognise it? Does it address it? Does it try and remedy the situation? Well, I want to briefly look at those principles in action, just as a final sort of exemplification. There are many communities we can join, as we've already touched on. Let's test them with these things. There are plenty of exam board communities online. You can join exam board communities on Facebook, and, they can be fantastic. They are great places that share. So are they open and inclusive? Yes, as long as you're part of the board, presumably you can go and join them. If you're not, you can, but I don't know why you would. Do they share resources? Yes, they do. Do they allow people to have a positive impact on students? Yes, I think they do. Does it have principles rooted in the needs of all children? Well, I think we get more problematic here because it has principles, but obviously exam board communities have principles that are generally rooted in the needs of exam results, and that's kind of their remit. So they're not designed to be any broader than that. There are a number of posts I see on exam board communities that tend to be, well, if it's not going to result in better results, maybe we don't bother. And I think that is a more problematic aspect of these. It's not everybody, but it's there. And again, it's understandable, but it means it's probably not a community. It might be part of it as a professionally useful place to be, but I wouldn't necessarily spend all my time contributing to it. What about research ed? That's been a pretty major player in the market for a while now. Well, I think it's open and inclusive. Pretty much anybody can go to it. But it has other problems, just like other things here. So does it enable members to have a positive impact on students? Yes and no. It does, but it's often very generic. It's often non-history teachers speaking. about generic principles in teaching. So it might have some impact, but it might not work in history. Does it prioritise collective learning and participation? That's where I think we get a bit more dodgy. I think what we get here is probably what I would call the cult of edu celebrity, where you can see the timetable here is just a list of speakers. And there's that idea that you go along to learn from their wisdom and then you apply what they say. You're not part of the process of the meaning making necessarily there. The biggest problem I have with Research Ed, though, as a community, is I don't think it has principles, or rather, it says it doesn't. And if you look at the way it bills itself, it says working out what works. It's a kind of an attempt to sidestep the issue of having principles in education and what's right and wrong and having a moral stance on something. And actually that leads us to some really problematic areas. So I don't know how many of you saw the row over the advisor to Downing Street, Andrew Sabisky, who lasted a few days, I think, before it turned out that he had some really quite problematic views on eugenics and intelligence. And it was really quite problematic, and he ended up stepping down quite rapidly. Well, he was invited on more than one occasion to Research Ed to present. And he presented some of those ideas, and I know because I've been in one of those sessions where those ideas were presented and received not enough challenge, because not everybody in there was an expert on those kinds of issues. And so if you don't have principles, you end up promoting ideas that are deeply, deeply problematic like these. Is Research Ed honest and open about that? Because we can all make mistakes. Well, you can find no reference to Andrew Sabisky ever having spoken at Research Ed now unless you look very hard. And I think that probably tells us a lot. Schools History Project, I've talked about already, so I'm not going to talk about massively here, but I think it does tick most of these boxes. It is open, it's inclusive, you can join. We would love to be more diverse, and I think that's been a big aim for us over the last few years. We have principles, I've talked to you about those, and I think they do guide action. It's all about seeking the needs and to promote the needs of children, and it prioritises collective participation. So there are a whole range of things you can get involved with. And of course, there are also teacher planning groups that have been going now for a couple of years, which you can get involved with. And they're really just teachers who fancy getting together and talk about how we replan a unit. And it's about discussion. And the act of participating there is much more important. So does it enable members to have a positive impact? Yes. Are we honest and open to criticism? I hope so as well. And it's not just SHP, of course. There are others. I revealed and I showed some articles from Teaching History and maybe the narrowness of some of the content. But actually, since 2019, there's been a really big push in Teaching History to publish more widely. And I also showed you an article from there. So the Historical Association are doing a lot of work in this area now. Justice to History, another group who are focusing at a very principled stance on the need to create more inclusive, more diverse, decolonised curricula. And it starts from the needs of children in that sense. So they're another community you can go and get involved with. Be Bold History Network, the same sort of thing. They are principle-based communities that allow people to get involved and discuss and debate and move things forwards. Those are the kinds of places I would spend my time. So that leads us to one last question. If we know which communities we want to be part of, how do we take part responsibly as members of those communities? Well, after the invasion of France in 1940, Bloch actually goes one step further. He realises in the 1940s, in 1942, that it's no longer just enough to defend the ideas of what he thinks is really good history. He needs to defend the underlying principles as well of humanity, of equality. And in 1942, he joins the French Resistance. And in doing that, he now is actively involved in undermining the Nazi occupation of France. And in the long run, his actions, in only a small way, will contribute to the eventual defeat of the Nazis in Europe. But of course, he doesn't necessarily see the end of that. As part of his actions in the French Resistance, he was arrested in 1944. And on the 16th of June, he was taken to face a firing squad, along with a number of other French Resistance prisoners. And as he's lined up, he is placed next to a 16-year-old boy. And we have some eyewitness accounts that tell us actually what happens here, which is remarkable, really. They're standing and they are facing this firing squad and awaiting execution. And the boy turns to Bloch and says to him, "Will the bullets hurt?" And Bloch turns to the boy and he holds his hand and he says, "Only for a moment." And then he shouts, "Vive la France!" And the firing squad open fire and they are murdered. And I think that's a powerful story. I think it's partly what makes Block my history hero, because I think it tells me an awful lot about Block as a member of his two sort of major communities here. He stood and he fought for a liberated France, for a France that was based in Republican ideals, and he died for that at the very end. And he also stood as part of a community of people who believe in common humanity, and the humanity that he shows to the boy in his final moments, I think tell us an awful lot about how communities shape us and empower us and enable us to have an impact on the situation, even when it's beyond our control. And that fight for liberty, obviously, in the long run, has an impact. And the Nazi machine is ultimately defeated, thanks partly to the actions of the French resistance, but also history changes as well, thanks partly to the work that Bloch has done in the 20s and the 30s, and in his book, and the results of that as well. So sometimes change is slow in coming, but through community, we can impact that change and we can bring it about. So what does it mean to be a really good member of a community? Well, hopefully none of us are going to be in a position where we will face a life or death choice about the communities we are part of. However, we can do things to make our communities better places to be. We can be actively inclusive. The RHS Race Report of 2018 showed there's an enormous underrepresentation of BME students in undergrad, postgrad history, university history, and in teacher training as well. And lots of that is linked back to a lack of diversity in curricula and students from BME backgrounds who turn off to history. So if we really want to be committed to change, we both need to be inclusive with people now and invite them to come along to join the communities we're part of. But we also need to be committed to the long-term change, to curriculum that will enable us to have more young people from BME backgrounds going to study history and being historians and being history teachers. We need to experiment. Real professional communities rely on people participating actively. We need to experiment with things, and we need to put them into practice, and we need to try them out, and then we need to think about how they went and come and share them with other people. Join a planning group, take part, and you will find you are part and join a community. Support your community. Communities only thrive through participation. Wenger talks about that. If we really want to be able to have an influence, we need to have communities that can bring about that change. And the more support those communities get, the more change they can bring. I don't know how many of you saw the Reddit community coming together to bring down investment companies over this weekend. But that was a powerful example of how that can happen. Even more so when it's based, like in the example of the Chartists here, in principles. But actually, I don't think that fight is just about the violent fight, as maybe in the Chartists. I think sometimes it's more about the power that community gives us to continue the fight and give us our identity to keep plugging away and challenging the problems that we see in our education system. And those of you who watched Steve McQueen's rendering of the Mangrove 9 story over Christmas will know that the victory of the Mangrove 9 over the racist police force in court and the judicial system in court in 1970 wasn't just a victory in court. It was a victory because it enabled the Mangrove restaurant to stay at the heart of a community. And that restaurant became the heart of change. And it wasn't through violence, it was through community spirit. Thriving communities are rooted in principles of truth and justice, and they can change things. So support your communities, join communities, but think carefully about the ones that you do join. Keep talking, and keep talking about the ethics of what we do. So if you went to or if you go to SHP conferences, you might have seen things like this. This is Jamie Byram talking about helping low attainers in history, getting them excited, enthused, engaged. They want to keep going. People here talk about diversifying their curriculum through the books they read, happening at SHP last year. This is Miranda Kaufman talking to Schools History Project in 2019 about Black Tudors and studying Black Tudors. And all those people with their hands up saying, yes, we'd love to get that taught in schools. And we're seeing change happen. More and more schools teach that. And that's partly because there's a community of teachers committed to making it happen. Not just at SHP, more broader than that as well. But it's there. Come and talk. And I promise, you will make friends. You'll get people you will talk to about these things. And these things will begin to happen. So there's a whole range of things there, I think, that being a really good principal member of a community involves. I want to finish with just one last bit from Bloch. He talks here in The Historian's Craft about his desire for historians, and I will add to this history teachers. So he says, I should like historians and history teachers, above all the younger ones, to reflect on the hesitancies and the incessant soul-searchings of our craft. It will be the surest way they can prepare themselves by deliberate choice to direct their efforts reasonably. And to me, that's what we need to do now. Professional communities can be incredibly powerful. There are powerful voices out there that aren't doing things that lead to a history that involves truth and justice and is inclusive and life-enhancing for everybody. So we need to challenge that, and we challenge that through the communities we join. And that is the kind of wrestling that happens in our choice of communities, in the work we do in those communities, that enables us to have a positive impact on the history that every young person in this country has been taught, so that they go away from it being enriched by that experience, so that everybody has the opportunity to study real, true, transformative history. We do that through communities. We hope you'd love to do that through the Community of Schools History Project, but to be honest, I don't mind which community you do it through, as long as it's about promoting these aims for young people. Okay, thanks ever so much for sticking with me in this series. I hope it's been at least a point to get you thinking about professional communities and the role of professional communities. If you would like to find out a little bit more about the role of the SHP and what we can do, please do visit our website at www.schoolshistoryproject.co.uk. If you'd like more of my thoughts on random things, then I'm www.andallthat.co.uk. And of course, you can contact me on Twitter at APF102 or Schools History Project at 1972 SHP. It would be lovely if any of you have thoughts, just to have that discussion online. And I look forward to hearing from you. Thanks ever so much again for listening.